The scene begins as a stunning woman slowly opens her eyes. Her long, ebony hair cascades around her face, accentuating her beauty. She finds herself encircled by a group of strikingly handsome men, their presence radiating an air of mystique and allure. One of them steps forward, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Please marry us, Cog Wu." For 5 long years, she had devoted herself to the temple, serving as its akara while being the crown prince's lover. "Don't you understand?" His voice wavered between reason and desperation. "If you can't bear an heir, you cannot be empress. It's just a political marriage. But know this, I love only you." Yet, the title he offered felt like a mere token, an afterthought, a concubine's role, no more than a consolation prize. "You expect me to accept this? To stand by while you marry another woman, while I'm relegated to the status of a concubine?" As the men stood before her, each asking for her hand in marriage, she was taken aback, stunned by the sheer gravity of the moment. She blinked in disbelief and asked, "You all want to marry me?" One of the men stepped forward, gently taking her hand and pressing a soft kiss to it. With a smile, he spoke, "Yes, the 30 sons of Elon Dos ask for your hand in marriage. Please, be our bride." Even now, I never could have imagined this day would come that I would be proposed to by 30 men from this mystical race. Few months ago, the torrential rain hammered relentlessly against the earth, drenching the ground until it was saturated. Each time the wagon's wheels rolled through the muddy road, the muck released a thick, gurgling sound, as though the land itself was drowning. The downpour was unceasing, as if intent on washing away every last breath of life from the world. "Akarna, are you feeling unwell?" The coachman's voice cut through the rhythmic patter of rain, directing his concern toward the black-haired woman seated inside the carriage. Akarna sat in silence, her gaze vacant as she watched raindrops trace crooked paths down the fogged window. After a long pause, she nodded faintly in response, her movements sluggish and distant. Even with her answer, the coachman circled the carriage several more times, his boots splashing in the mud as he anxiously checked her condition through the window before finally moving away. Inside the carriage, the woman's solitude was punctuated by snatches of conversation from the men outside. Their murmurs drifted between the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves and the sloshing wheels as they trudged through the mire. "The Akarna doesn't look well. Do you think she's all right? Isn't this her first time heading to the outskirts? She could be feeling uneasy." The next voice dropped to a hush, hesitant, as though treading into dangerous territory. "Or, maybe she's upset about the crown prince's engagement." The word hit her like a blow. Engaged. Her fingers tightened in her lap, the knuckles whitening as the dreaded word sank deep. It was a word she had hoped to avoid for as long as possible, a word that echoed the end of something she had once cherished. The man she had loved for 5 years, despite the opposition of both the temple and the imperial family, was now promised to another. But he wasn't just any man. He was the crown prince of the empire. His marriage could never be simple, and she had always known that. His bride would come from the noblest of families, and indeed she had. The woman set to marry him was the eldest daughter of the Margrave, an ancient and venerable house that had stood as the empire's shield for centuries, guarding its borders against the beasts that prowled the edges of civilization. Their fief was strategic, and though political ties had not yet been cemented, this engagement seemed to seal the alliance at last. A story of grand design, the empire's golden prince, a hero even in his youth, and the Margrave's daughter, a beautiful lady born into nobility and privilege, adored by all. Together, they painted a perfect portrait of romance and duty. But Akarna's reality was far removed from that dream. She was a revered figure, the temple's chosen one, but her title granted her little support in matters of the heart. The temple upheld their sacred responsibilities, yes, but only as long as she fulfilled her role as Akarna, a role far removed from anything resembling the life of a noblewoman. While others could live grand lives of courtly splendor, hers was a path marked by isolation and duty. Even now, she journeyed with only a handful of escorts, not to some luxurious destination, but to the desolate outskirts of the empire, where the land itself suffered under the corruption of black miasma. Her duty was clear, to purify the tainted earth, to bring solace to those ravaged by the miasma's touch. This was her burden, the will of the gods she must obey. As the rain continued to pour, she sat in the carriage, the weight of her duty pressing as heavily upon her heart as the crown prince's engagement lingered in her thoughts. Doing that worthwhile work, she earned the praises of people and was revered as a saint. But even if she keeps doing that, a grand event will soon be held. The engagement ceremony of the man she loves. She closed her eyes. The person she secretly met despite the opposition of the temple. The person who taught her how to write and speak. Even after being betrayed like that, she still missed him. His touch and voice whispering of love when no one was there was faint. One day was enough to turn the whole world upside down. One day, instead of the mechanical sound of her desk's alarm clock, Seo Jiwo woke up to many people watching her. She was inside a pure white building with the large columns behind those people. Without thinking deeply, she could tell that this place was like a temple. She was at the center of all those people. She was sitting in a place that was perhaps an altar. She was wearing the same pajamas she had worn before going to bed. But she was not bewildered by the sudden change of environment. One of them came up to her. He seemed like a high priest. An elegant robe. A high crown worn over his head. And the people around him bowed his head as he stepped forward. Even though it wasn't the type of clothes that she usually saw, she could tell that this was a place that people considered sacred. If this place was a temple, that person seemed to be a bishop. But as he bowed his head politely to her, Jiwo became more confused. He opened his mouth. "It is nice to meet you, Akarna. What an honor it is to meet you." Surprisingly, she could understand him. He wasn't speaking in Korean, but Jiwo could understand the strange language. Akarna. You, the guardian Akarna who has descended from the heavens to enact the will of the Lord. Jiwo let out a rather stupid reaction, but it wasn't because she agreed with what he said. She could only understand the speech, but she couldn't speak the language. Without a moment to react, he grabbed Jiwo's arm and cut off Jiwo's palm in an instant. Jiwo flinched and let out a shallow scream. But surprisingly, the pain was not bad. Compared to the deep cut left by the knife, the stinging pain she felt was like just a needle stab. Blood trickled down, but it stopped quickly. Not even a scar was left. This is the most sure proof that Akarna has been favored by the gods. The priest cut his hand this time with the dagger. The priest grabbed Jiwo's hand before she could even say anything, then guided Jiwo's blood over his wound. The drop seeped into the wound, and his wound healed just as Jiwo's was. This is proof that Akarna came down to enact the will of God here on earth. The old priest smiled kindly at Jiwo, who opened her mouth in surprise. "Should I show you more? You can say yes, or no." "No." He seemed kind at first glance, but he gave off the impression that this suggestion was not just a suggestion. From that day on, Seo Jiwo began to live in a temple in this unfamiliar world. Before she could adjust to the environment, she had to accept her position here. The Akarna was a fairly high position in the temple. Before she could say what her name was, Seo Jiwo was treated as Akarna and called Akarna. It was difficult to communicate well just by understanding the unfamiliar language. It was fortunate that she was able to pick up the words and listen, but whenever she tried to speak, what came out was just gibberish. Meanwhile, she had to fulfill Akarna's duties. A duty to take care of the sick and rid the contaminated land of miasma. If there was such a thing as a real god and God entrusted her with these duties, shouldn't she have been briefed beforehand? But in the temple, her opinions were not considered important at all. Deprived of the freedom enjoyed by modern people, when asked to go somewhere, she went, and when asked to come, she came. Besides that, the temple needed the Akarna greatly, but they didn't deem Seo Jiwo's safety as important at all. They believed that if Seo Jiwo died, the spirit of the Akarna that resided within her body would just transfer to another body. If Jiwo neglected her duty as the Akarna, they would kill her without any hesitation, thinking that the spirit of the Akarna had found the wrong body. The old nobleman in the temple spoke in a gracious tone, but in the end that was what he meant. She thought of escaping from the temple, but this world was too unfamiliar to Seo Jiwo. This world was a place where a caste system existed, and if a foreigner like her, who was unfamiliar with language and culture, were to go out alone, she would immediately be turned into a slave. In the end, as the days went by, she became more and more depressed. When she barely had time to be alone, Jaiwo would squat in the shadow of the temple building and pass the time idly. Only the sky was the same as the Korean sky in her world. So she was able to forget her reality a little bit. Why are you crying in a place like this? That was when she first met him. She didn't even get up from her spot and turned her gaze to where the voice was heard. He was a stranger who was accompanied by a couple of knights. A face she had never seen in the temple where she had lived for over a year. He seemed to glow as he stood with his back to the sun, and she couldn't even look straight ahead at first. He was a beautiful person. He had impressive vivid black hair despite the light, and his neat forehead and bright red eyes under the thick eyebrows gave a reliable impression like the sun. She thought the man was saying some weird things, but it really brought tears to her eyes. Thank you. The man was not offended. He just looked curious. Jaiwo didn't know how to speak formally, so she was sweating all over. The man did not question anything, but the knights behind him looked more surprised. Jaiwo was restless during the bazaar meeting. The person who ended this was the servant of the temple who was looking for Akarna. Akarna. You're here. The servant rushed to Jaiwo's front, as she was stunned. He noticed the situation and gave some excuse. Greetings, Your Highness the Crown Prince, the Akarna doesn't know much about the earthly words yet. Akarna? This one? The Crown Prince, who looked down at Jaiwo, smiled picturesquely after a while. If she doesn't know the words yet, does that mean she is still in the process of learning? Yes. That's right, Your Highness. Then, Akarna, would you like to learn to read and write from me? Jaiwo and the servant were surprised at the same time. The Crown Prince did not stop smiling and held out his hand to Jaiwo, who was wary. Nevertheless, I came to meet the Akarna of this generation, and it seems that I came to the right place. The Empire is receiving a lot of help from you, Akarna, so I also want to be of help to you through this opportunity. I will be staying in the castle for a while, so spend some time with me. For Jaiwo, she desperately needed to learn the language that she could only understand. In the temple, she was given just two choices, yes or no. Even if she occasionally tried to express a different opinion, she was usually rejected because the Akarna had to be the model of the temple. It was also because she didn't make progress even when she tried to learn. It was the first time anyone had approached the Akarna like that. Jaiwo yearned to form any human relationship at all, and so she took the Crown Prince's hand. His name was Aleph. Crown Prince Aleph of the Karbad Empire. The largest and most powerful country in the world. He was the Crown Prince of the Empire and a hero who led the war to victory. He seemed to be the same age as she was, but he had already gone on the battlefield and led his army to victory. She was curious as well as longing to listen. He was a good teacher to the Akarna. She had no problem understanding speech, and as she was determined to learn words and letters, the rest was easy. Akarna, you're a fast learner, aren't you? Have you ever studied before? Rather, when the Crown Prince offered to teach, he was amazed at Jaiwo as she learned quickly. I've been going to school since I was little. Since childhood. Having an opportunity to learn at a young age is not an easy task even in the Empire. It seems that you have experienced it for a long time? The Crown Prince suddenly grabbed her hand. Jaiwo thought her heart was pounding, but he only looked at the traces that remained deep in her hand after holding the pen too long. Jaiwo tried to calm her noisy heart and said, Yes, about 16 years? You look young. The empire developed faster than other places and was ahead in every way, but public education was not as developed as in modern Korea. How could this place compare to a country in her world? In the end, Jaiwo chose her words and gave an answer. It's common in my birthplace. Anyway, it's delightful that you're fun to teach. Jaiwo, accustomed to Korea's overtime culture, was constantly busy until the Crown Prince intervened, providing her with a momentary reprieve despite her tight schedule. Although the temple made no effort to address Jaiwoo's communication difficulties, leading her to suspect it was intentional, she felt immense gratitude towards the crown prince, even though it may not have seemed like a significant gesture to him. Then one day, during class, he said, "You can't always study like this. Why don't we go out together?" "How? Where?" "Follow me. The temple imposes a rule on you that's too old-fashioned." "But right now, at a time like this, just say let's go, Your Highness." He led Akarna, speaking like a good teacher. She couldn't forget the memories of that day. It was wondrous to find out which part of the temple had a hole where a single person could escape through, where a dark robe could be found to hide her appearance, and the reason why the escorts who were always attached to her suddenly became friendly. Then, everything that flowed like water was just so strange. The crown prince, who had changed his dark black hair to the more common brown in some way, quickly changed his attitude and acted like a commoner. Her heart was pounding again as he took off his splendid clothing and became like an ordinary young man from the village. As she went outside, Jaiwoo felt refreshed. As an ordinary person, not Akarna, she escaped the stuffy temple for the first time. In the bar, crown prince ordered food for her. In the temple, she was forced to live a frugal life, so she was forced to eat a small amount of food, but she was originally a present-day human on Earth who had chicken delivered and drank beer on days when there were good things. The meat was dripping in fat and the dark liquor tasted really good. It has been a long time since she could describe the feeling of heavy chewy food with juices and a pungent scent going down her throat, which could only be described as exhilaration. Jaiwoo savored the food with an excited face, but she soon heard a light chuckle. The crown prince rested his chin on his hand and smiled. "I didn't know our Akarna could drink so well." "Well, is it okay to say something like that?" "What?" The word Akarna? It's okay. Akarna is not only a temple Akarna, but also a slang term for a lovely lover. The crown prince smiled as he reassured Jaiwoo, who was looking around in surprise. Maybe it was because she was drunk after a while, Jaiwoo's heart raced even when he looked like that. The carriage was shaking badly because of the heavy rain and muddy road. It started to tip over, and I was afraid of falling off the cliff. I quickly grabbed onto anything I could find to hold myself steady. Her escorts, their faces etched with terror, frantically searched for a means to save her. Yet, their efforts proved futile. As she witnessed their desperation, a chilling realization dawned upon her: she was alone, abandoned by both the temple and the crown prince she had so cherished. In a moment of despair, she made the unthinkable decision, plunging over the cliff's edge. Jaiwoo, after falling from a cliff, wakes up disoriented and finds herself at the base of a mountain. It is dark all around her, and although the rain has stopped, she feels a deep chill from being soaked for so long. She is surprised that she survived the fall, and upon checking her body, she notices scratches from branches and stones but no severe injuries. However, she is trapped under a large tree. With great effort, Jaiwoo frees her legs and tries to stand but nearly collapses due to an injured ankle. The ground beneath her is slippery and muddy from the rain. Despite her current condition, she believes that the escort knight, who lost track of her during the fall, will eventually find and rescue her if she waits. As she was thinking whether to wait here, there was an eerie sound. It wasn't the sound of leaves being trampled on, nor was it the sound of the wind sweeping through the leaves. Is it a beast? The carriage was heading far from the castle, and the more it moved, the closer it was to the miasma-trodden land where the beasts appeared. She was about to arrive, so she could have met the beasts. How unlucky. Besides that, raindrops started to fall again. If she stayed up all night in the rain here, she would surely die this time. It would be better to find a cave, or at least a place where she wouldn't get soaked to the bone. It was going to be like this, I shouldn't have let go for no reason. Thank God. I found one. After walking for a while, she finally found a place to shelter from the rain. It wasn't a stone cave, but it was a large hollow space created by strangely curved tree roots. But after walking for a while, Jaiwoo suddenly stopped. It was because there was someone else deep under the root of the tree. She gulped down her dry throat. These races don't even want to believe in divine power, and the alchemists on the outer wall think that it's blasphemy to use divine power. They looked different from humans, had different views and values, and above all, were hostile to humans. It was a male individual of the other race. She had heard that they looked different from humans, but she had never actually seen them. But when she met them like this, it was immediately recognizable. The color of the hair hanging down one side of his shoulder was mysteriously pale. She could call it silver hair, but if she looked closely, she could see that there was a blue tinge reminiscent of a forget-me-not flower faintly mixed in it. Most importantly, those ears were not human ears. Long ears that are not covered by long hair. The tip was pointed and it looked like rabbit ears. The ears, which were erected upwards, seemed to be listening to Jaiwo's footsteps. Glared at her fiercely before Jaiwo could even recognize him. He made a menacing sound with his teeth and got very wary of Jaiwo. It sounded like a snake hissing. It wasn't to threaten her, only to scare her. But he didn't attack. He couldn't. As it should be, as he was already wounded. It was also an injury suffered by the beast. Jaiwo hesitated for a moment, then approached the injured man. That wound, I can take care of it. It was when Jaiwo approached as if reaching out. With the sound of sharp metal cutting through the air, Jaiwo was startled and fell backwards. The pain came late. Not from her hip, but from her arm. He took the dagger out of his arms and cut Jaiwo. Blood dripped from the cut on her arm. This was a wound that healed quickly as the akara, but Jaiwo wasn't a strong-willed person enough to brush off this kind of attack casually. Above all, since becoming akara, she had never met such unconditional hostility. Calming her madly pounding chest, Jaiwo slumped down and dragged her body, barely moving away from him. As she retreated closer to the entrance, she felt the rain was more intense than before. But now that her body is weak, the wound has been quite painful for some time. Her body was terribly cold. Fortunately, it was midsummer, so she would be able to survive in this state for about one night. It hurts. Would it be strange if physical pain was rather more welcome? Thinking of the crown prince, it felt like a needle was pierced through her heart periodically. It hurts like she was going to die, but it wasn't. It was a pain that was debilitating her more and more because she couldn't ignore it. Jaiwo heard strange noises and opened her eyes. Her body was so tired that she sat down and fell asleep. The man's condition, lying injured, seemed to have gotten worse. The miasma rising from his wounds filled the space. The dagger that had been used to threaten Jaiwo until before was rolling on the floor as he let go of it. That dagger worked well on me. Jaiwo looked at the sharply shining dagger in the midst of the space and raised her body. He was groaning while unconscious. Jaiwo came closer and picked up the dagger instead. She only ever sharpened knives or scissors. Jaiwo tilted her wrist, dripping blood, pouring all over his wounds as the man groaned. Because of the large amount of blood flowing from her, the miasma was purified at a much faster speed than usual. The man's groaning gradually faded. She had no intention of improving his condition, so she didn't want to closely monitor his recovery. She tried to stay close to see it. Her vision was blurry anyway. Tears flowed and she couldn't see anything. Soon enough, her vision blackened. She felt someone grab her arm. She just lost consciousness. Oh, everything was nothing but a bother. Jaiwo, deeply in love with the crown prince, grows closer to him despite her uncertainty about their future. They meet during peaceful times, and though Jaiwo fears he may no longer need her, the prince continues to seek her out. During a mission, they share a passionate kiss, revealing mutual feelings. Jaiwo, as the akara, believes their love is divinely blessed and embraces her new life in the empire. After 5 years of happiness, Jaiwo is devastated to hear rumors of the crown prince's engagement to a count's daughter. When confronted, the prince confirms it's a political marriage but insists he loves only her. He dismisses her concerns, reminding her of her lack of power and position. Jaiwo is left heartbroken, realizing her role as akara offers no real authority, and her period has stopped since assuming the position. During the 5 years of meeting with the crown prince, they had no children. Jaiwo was obviously infertile. To tell the crown prince not to meet anyone was the same as telling him to give up on having an heir. Jaiwo realizes the difficult truth about her relationship with the crown prince, Aleph, as he's seated too high for her to love freely. When Jaiwo learns of his engagement to the count's daughter, she feels powerless. Though Aleph tries to comfort her, saying he will convince his fiancée and that the marriage is political, Jaiwo feels like a pet, treated with disdain. At an event hosted by the crown prince, Jaiwo meets the count's daughter. The woman acknowledges Jaiwo in a condescending manner, suggesting they can work together. The count's daughter believes her role is to provide Aleph with noble heirs, while Jaiwo's role is to bless him as the akara. She speaks confidently, addressing Aleph by his name and pointing out that Jaiwo is still a commoner, despite her sacred position. Jaiwo feels belittled as the woman casually mentions her sacrifices, including accepting Jaiwo's presence in Aleph's life. Rumors swirl about their complex relationship, casting Jaiwo as a hindrance to Aleph's life. She comes to realize that her love for Aleph was sincere, but his love was always calculated, based on his ambitions. Jaiwo sacrificed everything for him, even willing to abandon her past and stay in this world for him, while Aleph never gave up anything of value for her. His love could never surpass his goals, and Jaiwo's love wasn't grand enough to make him prioritize her. Despite Aleph's assurances that he would not abandon her, only offering her a realistic position, Jaiwo feels utterly disrespected. She reflects on how her opinion and feelings were never considered, and how they expected her to accept her fate as an honor. Anger and disappointment overwhelm her, especially when the count's daughter mocks her for expecting Aleph to choose her over a noble alliance. Jaiwo finally acknowledges that she's merely a stranger in this world, unwanted and unimportant in the grand scheme of things. She then fell on the ground and that handsome guy was beside her. The cold water trickled down onto Jaiwo's forehead, gently pulling her from unconsciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and a bright light blurred her vision. It felt like a long time passed before she could make out her surroundings. The first thing she saw were the twisted roots of a tree, dripping with water. Was she still lying here? Jaiwo hurriedly pushed herself up. Despite lying there for what felt like an eternity, she wasn't cold. Someone had draped a thick cloth over her, and not far away, a small fire burned, offering warmth. Her thoughts scattered. I cut my arm, she remembered. She glanced down at her arm, now carefully wrapped in clean, white cloth. She winced and abandoned the thought of inspecting it further. When the rescue team arrives, I'll just follow them, she told herself. She had impulsively tried to end it all, but she had failed, and now the thought of death scared her. Even if she was treated like an outsider here, she had no choice. Her brooding was interrupted by a rustling sound near the entrance of the cave. Jaiwo looked up and saw him. His silver hair, tinted with a light blue hue, gleamed in the sunlight, much brighter than when she had seen him in the dark. He hesitated for a moment, watching her cautiously. After a moment of deliberation, he stepped closer. They stared at each other in silence. Neither spoke a word. The man finally unwrapped a cloth bundle, revealing freshly picked berries, mushrooms, and herbs. Despite the inviting aroma, Jaiwo didn't feel the slightest appetite. After a while, the man spoke. Encouraged by this response, the man offered her a berry, a red fruit she had been eyeing earlier. Take it. Aren't you hungry? He asked. Jaiwo shook her head, refusing the offer. To prove it was safe, the man ate one himself. No poison, he assured her, holding the fruit out again. I'm sorry, he said, recognizing her discomfort. I apologize for attacking you earlier. Jaiwo remained silent. Or can't you speak? He ventured cautiously. After a pause, she finally responded. I can only speak the Imperial language. The man hesitated before responding in broken Imperial. Right. His words were clumsy, but he managed to communicate. It's my first time speaking with a human, he admitted, frowning as if the experience perplexed him. Jaiwo said nothing. He continued, seemingly embarrassed. I know it's polite to repay someone who saved your life. I don't need anything, she replied flatly. Then at least allow me to escort you to a human village, he offered. There's no need. A rescue team will come for me. His face fell, his words halting. I see. Realizing he had nothing more to say, the man laid out all the berries, fruits, and meat he had cooked. He then removed his cloak and draped it over her, clicking his tongue at the sight of her thin clothes. She decided to leave and try to find her way back. Limping, she followed the path that had led her here, hoping someone would eventually find her. Her legs ached, her energy fading with every step. She eventually collapsed against a large tree, closing her eyes to rest. When she awoke, it felt like her body was floating. A pleasant scent filled her senses, and when she opened her eyes, she realized she was being carried. Startled, Jaiwoo tried to struggle free, but the man holding her spoke calmly. Stay still. What's happening? She stammered, still half asleep. You've been unconscious for 3 days, he explained. Didn't you say someone would come for you? Why hasn't anyone shown up? Put me down, she weakly protested. I can't. You'll die if I leave you here. Jaiwoo felt a strange mixture of fear and resignation. As if sensing her thoughts, he added, I will send you back once you've recovered. Those words stilled her. She relaxed against his back, her exhaustion overpowering her will to resist. Will you really send me back? She asked quietly. Yes, he promised. I will send you back to your home. A pang of longing surged through her at the mention of home. She wasn't sure where home was anymore, but she wanted to believe his words. Jaiwoo stopped struggling. I want to go home, she murmured. As he carried her through the forest, the fatigue weighed on her heavily. She eventually fell back into a fitful sleep. Jaiwoo, delirious from fever, believes a man is trying to poison her. He assures her it's medicine to lower her temperature and demonstrates by taking it himself. When she struggles to drink it, he forces the medicine into her mouth by kissing her. At first, she resists, but the sweet taste of his saliva overcomes her repulsion. She swallows the medicine and continues kissing him, driven by a desperate need for comfort and sustenance. The kiss deepens, and they share a moment of intimacy. Afterward, the man pulls away, his face flushed with embarrassment. Jaiwoo apologizes, and he assures her it's okay, understanding her confusion and vulnerability. The man of Lanciel, as he later introduced himself, tended to her, feeding her and ensuring she drank water. Though he tried to heal her, she was still haunted by feverish dreams and an overwhelming sense of dislocation. Even after regaining some strength, Lanciel continued to care for her. He would dress her wounds and even change her clothes when she was too weak to do so herself. Jaiwoo, though initially embarrassed, quickly grew accustomed to his presence. One day, when she could finally sit up, she asked him, Where are we going? To my people, he replied. You need a place to recover safely. Jaiwoo frowned. She wasn't used to being cared for like this. Everyone in her world saw her as Akarna, a person with divine powers meant to serve mankind. But Lanciel didn't seem to see her that way. I can walk on my own now, she protested. He shook his head firmly. Your recovery powers are strong, but they can work against you. Your body heals quickly, but not always correctly. Your ankle was mending improperly. If you continue walking. The man holding her looked unreal, almost too handsome to be real. The crown prince had been handsome too, but his beauty was grounded in human standards, a type of good looks that could make someone a movie star in her world. He had the stature, the sharp features, and the lean, athletic build. But this man, he was different. His beauty was something beyond, something otherworldly. It wasn't just his face, though his features were striking. It was the way the light caught his hair, making it seem almost ethereal, as though it had never been dyed but had bloomed naturally, like a rare flower. He was tall, about the same height as the crown prince, with a similarly lean figure. But now, cradled in his arms, she could feel the strength in him, the solid muscle that belied his seemingly slender frame. His hair color puzzled her. It looked too natural to be dyed, almost floral in its softness. It was an odd comparison for such a well-built man, but the description suited him perfectly. His long ears were his most striking feature, the pointed tips adding to his surreal, elfin beauty. Jaiwo found herself in a rather awkward position, arms wrapped around his shoulders, unsure of where else to place them. But this closeness allowed her a clearer view of his face. His left ear, slightly cut, could heal quickly if she bled a little for him. Just a drop would do, enough to heal the tip of his ear. Years of being the Akarna had accustomed Jaiwo to inflicting minor injuries on herself. Without a second thought, she bit down on her thumb, hard enough to draw blood. She reached up and touched his ear with her bleeding hand. What? Lanciel, startled, almost dropped her. His arms loosened, and Jaiwo barely managed to keep her balance. He stared at her in shock, his face showing clear astonishment. You're an adult woman. Don't surprise me like that. His voice trembled more than it had when she accidentally deepened their kiss earlier, chasing the sweetness of the medicine he'd given her. Jaiwo blinked, equally startled by his sudden outburst. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. Lanciel, his face flushed bright red, coughed awkwardly, trying to compose himself. No, I don't mean to make a big deal out of it. He quickly glanced around, then gently set her down on a flat patch of ground, still looking flustered. Ahem. He cleared his throat several times before speaking again, trying to regain his calm demeanor. You didn't even tell me your name. Is that important? Jaiwo asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Lanciel's voice wavered slightly. Well, is it not? He seemed genuinely distressed by the fact that she hadn't shared her name. His reaction puzzled her. Would it matter if she told him? After all, they would part ways soon enough. But would giving her full name, Seo Jaiwo, even matter? People here could never pronounce it right anyway, and she hadn't heard it spoken in so long. It felt foreign to her now, a name belonging to someone she no longer was. Instead, she gave the name she had grown used to. Call me Akarna. Akarna? Lanciel echoed, his eyes widening slightly. Yes. I thought, you didn't like me, he said, adjusting his hair and straightening his clothes as if preparing for a formal introduction. She couldn't understand it, he was already stunning, even without trying. He stepped closer to her and extended his hand, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he intended to pick her up again. Hesitantly, she reached out and took his hand. It is an honor to have been chosen by you, he said, his voice soft with reverence. Before she could react, he raised her hand to his lips and kissed the back of it. The gesture was so swift and gentle that she barely registered it until it was done. Then, without warning, he cupped her cheeks and closed the distance between them. His lips touched hers, soft and unexpected, and a pleasant, sweet scent enveloped her, a fragrance that lingered as if it came from him directly. The taste was even sweeter, more intoxicating than honey. Startled, Jaiwo accidentally responded, her tongue brushing against his, before she pushed him away, flustered. Lanciel's eyes trembled, a look of slight hurt crossing his face. Have you changed your mind? What? Jaiwo stammered, her face flushing red with embarrassment. Was he implying that she had been the one to initiate this? This was her chance to say no, to clear the air, but when her eyes met his striking blue gaze, she froze. Before she could utter a word, his lips found hers again, more insistent this time. Her thoughts tangled. This wasn't pleasure, she told herself. It wasn't supposed to be. Yet her body betrayed her. His hand trailed up to her ear, and as his fingers gently brushed the sensitive curve, her body reacted involuntarily. Goosebumps rose along her skin, and a warmth spread through her lower body. His touch was careful, deliberate, and undeniably sensual. His hand moved down, stroking the nape of her neck, slipping under the edge of her collar. His touch was tender, yet electrifying, and Jaiwo was left reeling in shock. Was this what pleasure felt like, without the desperate need for validation? Without the rough, consuming passion she had endured with the crown prince? Even without love, this was pleasure. Lanciel's voice pulled her from her thoughts. You saved my life and chose me. My life is yours, forever. A fresh wave of tears spilled from Jaiwo's eyes. She didn't even know why she was crying anymore. Oh no. Akarna, Lanciel stammered, panicking at the sight of her tears. He seemed at a loss, unsure of how to comfort her without making it worse. Rain began to fall, as if the sky itself wept with her. Lanciel glanced upward and sighed. "We should find shelter from the rain," he said softly, his long ears twitching in the downpour. "There's a dry spot nearby. Come." Jaiwoo leaned into him as they moved, but the tears kept flowing. Lanciel hurried into the nearby shelter, cradling Jaiwoo gently in his arms. Without hesitation, he set her down and quickly lit a bonfire to warm her, the flames crackling softly as the heat began to fill the small space. Jaiwoo, sitting by the fire, stared blankly into the flickering light. Her thoughts churned, she knew she needed to clear up the misunderstanding between them. "Lanciel," she called softly. "Yes?" He turned to her immediately, his full attention on her, eyes wide with concern. "Come closer," Jaiwoo beckoned him, her voice steady but laced with something unspoken. Without hesitation, Lanciel moved toward her, trust clear in his actions. The moment he was close enough, Jaiwoo reached out quickly, her fingertip already wet with a drop of her own blood. She touched the tip of his ear. "Ugh." Lanciel flinched, a soft moan of surprise escaping him. His ears were evidently sensitive, and her touch sent an involuntary shiver through him. But that wasn't all. Akarna's blood had magical properties, and the drop she placed on his ear triggered the healing that hadn't worked before. The cut ear, once a symbol of his shame and failure, regenerated instantly, as if it had never been injured. Lanciel reached up, fingers brushing against both of his newly healed ears, the realization dawning on him. His face flushed crimson, his expression filled with a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. I made a big mistake in the first place," he stammered, avoiding Jaiwoo's gaze, his shame overwhelming him. The awkwardness of the moment became too much, and in his discomfort, Lanciel stood abruptly. "I'll go out and get some food," he muttered, eager to escape the tension in the air. But Jaiwoo didn't let him leave. "Lanciel." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but enough to stop him in his tracks. It was a small gesture, easy to miss, but to Lanciel, it was as if she had struck him with a heavy blow. It was the first time she had reached for him, an action that held a weight far greater than the motion itself. He froze, his gaze softening as he turned back to her. "Why? Are you still feeling sick?" His voice was tender, filled with concern. His keen ears had picked up the small shift in her movements, and he knew something was stirring in her heart, though he couldn't quite understand what. Jaiwoo's heart twisted painfully as memories of the crown prince surged within her mind. The man who had given his body and soul to another. The man she had once thought she needed to be loyal to, despite his betrayal. Why had she forced herself to remain fixated on him? Why had she believed his so-called sacrifices were for her, when all they had done was wound her? Was that the only path she had? She bit her lip, her inner conflict spilling over. What if it's not a mistake? Jaiwoo's voice was shaky, as if she were teetering on the edge of something unknown. Lanciel blinked, confused. "What? What if you were right, about what I want?" she whispered, her words trembling but clear. There was no flirtation in Jaiwoo's tone, no pretense of seduction. She wasn't playing coy, nor was she being forward. Instead, her face reflected something far more raw, fear. It was not desire for love that drove her confession, but desperation, a deep, aching need for something she couldn't fully understand. Her expression was heartbreakingly vulnerable, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She looked like someone clinging to life itself, as if reaching out to him was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. It was the same look of desperation she had worn the day she saved Lanciel, pulling him from the miasma that had nearly consumed him. Lanciel, his heart aching for her, gently took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with tender care. "I told you," he said softly, his voice steady, unwavering. "My life will be yours from now on." It didn't matter what this feeling was, what words could or could not express. What was clear was that something inside him had shifted, and it was that same feeling that had led him to her, the one who had saved him. He was bound to her now, not just by duty, but by something deeper, something that transcended words. And for Jaiwoo, in that moment, it wasn't love she sought. It was salvation. The story ends here, my dear friends. If you want us to continue this story, Then type, Saintess Part 2. Till then.
Bye!
And please like and comment and subscribe to our channel for new updates.